So welcome to the next in our series of professional briefings run by our wonderful membership committee. Hopefully we'll all gain some very interesting insights into boardroom behaviour in the next hour. But before we do that, if we just start with the usual housekeeping. As I said, if you keep your mics on mute until you get to ask questions towards the end of the meeting. We will be filming this evening's event and uploading it to our YouTube channel and to the websites of our membership committee members. So if you prefer not to do that, you can of course put yourselves or take your camera off. Questions are certainly encouraged, and indeed they make the evening go a lot quicker. And the great thing about questions is it keeps the speakers on their toes. So please ask as many as you can. I shall have great pleasure in handing you over now to Liveryman Justina Nake, who will begin the evening for us.
Thank you, Keith, and welcome to the past masters and wardens, members and guests. This evening's webinar is one in a series which is relevant to company secretaries and governance professionals locally, nationally and internationally. And today we'll be discussing, can boards make the right decisions, and the boardroom dynamics that underpin this. We are today joined by Sharon Constanson, the chairman of the WCCSA Membership Committee, which focuses on providing these networking and professional development sessions such as today, and supporting the pathway of new members into the company. And we are also joined by our speaker, Dr. Jeremy Cross. He's a chartered psychologist and author of The Good Governance Guide to Boardroom Dynamics. Jeremy has consulted globally with over 100 organisations, including Sainsbury's, RBS and Nike, and regularly speaks on the board. Sorry, I just realised I was on mute. From today's session, we'd like to achieve a considered view on the cultural and behavioural dynamics that can be at play in the boardroom, and highlighting what these experiences can look like in practice, the impact they can have, and for us to gain an insight on how we navigate these and positively influence board performance. So Sharon, if I can now hand over to you to lead the discussion.
Thank you, Justina. It's lovely to have the membership committee and its many component parts part of an exercise like this. Justina has been very, very supportive of the committee. I spend my time probably swearing more at Jeremy Cross than I'm doing anything else. And the reason being is I have the good fortune, pleasure to be the lecturer for boardroom dynamics for the Institute's final exam, level 7 exam. It's the last one the guys have to get through, and I have to say welcome to a number of my students who are present here at the moment. Thank you for joining us. I think they want to meet the man who's terrorized them so much in the last few months, and many of them actually a year or two. So thank you very much, Jeremy, for joining us. Guys, if we can have questions in the chat during the session as you think of things, by all means go ahead. I will collate those questions and then pose those to Jeremy. We'll then share that conversation, your content, but we will be having an informal session in the latter after the hour, and then it'll be open to everyone to ask questions directly. And if Jeremy stays on, that's fine. If he runs away, you've chased him away. So please don't do that. Jeremy, can I start in the very simple place that we all as board evaluators, board support individuals, sort of came to this realization post 2008, where the banks would have had, for example, the best governance possible. They would have all the formalities, the policies, the procedures, except as one of the, I can't remember this gentleman's name for a moment, and his comment was, life is simple until you add the human beings. And at that point, life becomes very complex and very complicated, and things start to go wrong. And whatever his name is, I agree with him. Life is very simple when you've got everything on a piece of paper, and then you add a human, and the first thing they open their mouth and is, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So we've all evolved. Even the regulators have evolved, whether it's financial services, FRC, a few others like that have all evolved to understand that it is the people that we have to worry about more. That has been your journey, and you're one of the first who've put together some text of this content of such depth that you've done under this textbook, because this is a massive book, my guys. If you look at our team, we do 10 weeks and we haven't even touched the surface of the content. So Jeremy, tell us about your journey and what's so important about having transitioned to behavioural concerns of what's going on in the boardroom.
Thanks, Sharon. Well, thank you all for inviting me. It's lovely to have this opportunity to share some of my thoughts. And good luck to all you students. And apologies.
You owe them.
Yeah, exactly. When I was approached by, well, as it was then, ICSA, now Chartered Governance Institute, to write the syllabus and the textbook, I was in a meeting. And we were kind of brainstorming, what could be in it, and what the structure of it might be. And I said, what's the word count going to be like? What do you need from this book? And they said 150,000 words. And I said, really? So we can blame them. But now the students have got it. But you asked about my story, I guess. So I'm a chartered psychologist by trade. So I guess my stance with all things, individuals, teams, groups, organizations, will often come from the human element and from a kind of behavioral lens at things. I started off, I've got a sporting background. I played tennis to a decent level, and got into psychology because I was interested in, the way people thought in terms of performance in sport originally, and became a doctor of sports psychology first. And then worked with coaches and with leaders in sport, and then graduated to leaders in organizations. And I guess my take on all this was that you can have all the best, supposedly best people in a team, in an organization, but unless the leadership isn't right, unless the culture's not right, then it's just not going to work. And the other way is true as well. You can have what seem like a group of people who aren't as competent potentially on paper, but who gel together and who can perform in outstanding ways. So Sharon said, you've got all these case studies within a governance level, within a board level, where Royal Bank of Scotland is kind of classic one, where boxes were ticked. Kids Company, recently, has also been in the news, but a whole raft of organisations where compliance may be there and boxes are ticked in terms of codes, and those are absolutely necessary, but my contention is they're not sufficient. It's the human element that either breaks this or makes it. So I guess I was working with senior leaders I've been for about 15, 20 years. And about 10 years ago, I went to, I was based at Henley, and I did an MBA there, master's in business. And as part of my research within that, I started looking at board evaluation. As Sharon says, around that time in 2010, a lot of interest was coming around board evaluation. I did some research on what is the current state of board evaluation, mostly in the UK. I'm sure lots of you will have lots of opinions on board evaluation now as well, and how that's come on. But my conclusion was, it's not that great. It's a bit patchy. And that was in 2010, and codes have evolved a little bit since then. But it's patchy largely because boards take most account of the technical factors on paper, and perhaps not as much account of the behavioral aspects in practice. I think that much of the research, much of the kind of good practice explains that and goes into that and says, it's not necessarily about all those things that the codes say are important that predicts performance. You have to have them, but then it's the dynamics and the human element, as Sharon said, that will make or break the governance outcomes. And in that great phrase, you talk about culture, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's a good summary of this as well, that we might have everything nailed on paper, we've done loads of analysis, but when the rubber hits the road, things don't necessarily turn out as planned. So I guess that's my interest, and that's the stance that I'm bringing to this conversation.
Thanks, Jeremy. Very insightful, and just gives us an idea of the beginning of the complexities. And I think one of the things we'll probably tease out in this conversation is part of the challenges I think that board directors have and chairmen have is you can't take it like a financial measure and measure it in the same way. It does have an element of the softer issues around it. It is more difficult to set metrics. It's more difficult to determine accountability to some of these things. So I think this, particularly to certain kinds of brains, it is a difficult one to get your mind around. I remember working with a finance director who became a chairman of a FTSE 250 and said, don't you ever use the word strategy in my boardroom, because there's no such thing as strategy. There's a business plan, there's a budget. Oh, goodness me, this is interesting. I'd like to just look at, if we talk about culture, do you want to just give us some of the key identifiers that you could share with us that we could say that when you collectively look at them, those are what determines that organization's culture? And I often use the example, if you walked into EY, or you walked into one of the big five legal firms, or you walked into an SME, or you walked into a design company, you would know which one you'd walked into, which is one of the aspects. But do you want to cover some of the others, and then we can maybe pull out and tease out some specific areas of interest?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess we're all aware of the language around culture. That word probably coming up more and more in recent years. I did an analysis of the number of times that the word culture has been used in the codes over time, and I haven't got it to mind, but it used to not be in there at all, and then it's just increasing. And if you look at codes internationally, it's also true. King Code, Sharon's I'm sure aware of. The culture is front and center in their first page. So it's an emerging thing. But when you ask people what is it, it's often a bit nebulous to get your hands around. And I mean, just to your point about I suppose finance people, I wouldn't say this is true of anyone, but one thing I would notice is that people often with professional or technical backgrounds, I'd include myself within that, we've been schooled our whole lives in a certain way of thinking, and then to jump from technical to behavioural is sometimes a bit different. And I remember working with an acting finance director once, and she was struggling with this, and we were talking about just the shift that she would need to make in terms of how she prepared for meetings. She was unbelievably conscientious, really well organised, did brilliant slide decks, had everything kind of buttoned down, but she wasn't getting the influence and impact that she wanted to. And we talked a lot about what she could do differently, and what she realised essentially was that she needed to make a shift from being technical to being relational. And it was less about getting the numbers right and the PowerPoint slide polished and then walking in. It was more about the conversations before and after the board, checking in with people, understanding the temperature of where different people stood. I think that's what a company secretary's role as well. So just kind of noticing that in terms of your previous point. But yeah, if I was kind of to jump in around culture, I think we need to distinguish between board culture itself and organizational culture. There may be different ways of looking at them, but they may have a different culture. Hopefully they will interact, and hopefully the board will be role modeling the culture that they would want to see in the organization. Sometimes that's not true. I'm working with one organization at the moment who's trying to challenge up to their board to role model a better culture. I think often it's starting in the middle management, a better culture. Certainly around feedback and willingness to receive messages, and the culture of a growth mindset. The board is not quite where the rest of the organization is yet. So that's interesting. I would always go to one of my guru favorites, a guy called Edgar Schein. I don't know if any of you come across Ed Schein. So he's someone who's written some seminal work on culture. Great guy. And one of his phrases that sticks in my head is, if you want to shift the culture, move the furniture. which I really like. So, you know, when I'm working face to face with groups, which hasn't been for a while, it's often just to literally take tables out and move things around. There's this whole idea of proxemics where, you know, just the layout of a room can create the dynamics, a different dynamic in the culture. So, you know, trying to make it more democratic, possibly. If you look at the 10 Downing Street table, if you kind of Google pictures of, you know, the 10 Downing Street, you know, the cabinet room, it's a terrible table. It's a long and thin table. The Prime Minister sits in the middle. The power is all in the middle. The people kind of on the side at the end have absolutely no chance of getting their voice in. I mean, maybe that's for a reason, but it's a terrible table from a kind of transparency, democratic dialogue point of view. So yeah, so first of all, move the furniture. But what Edgar Schein also says is he talks about culture being made of three things. So Sharon, you talk about, you know, what would you see when you go into, you know, these an office, for example, and that's the kind of surface level culture. That's the symbols and artifacts, he calls those. So, you know, if you kind of think about that just in terms of what you can see on the screen now, you know, when you look around the virtual room, what artifacts? I mean, Keith and I were talking about this, his beautiful library behind him. What artifacts is he showing me about his culture? I've obviously got some things in my background. There's a Japanese painting up there, which is from my wife and I's honeymoon. You know, what culture am I trying to create by my my artifacts that you can see around? So that's one level, but it's the surface, and he calls this model the iceberg model because that's just what you can see at the top of the iceberg. The real depth is underneath. So the other two layers are the espoused values. What do you say your culture is? And that's often, you know, on the website, in the brochures or whatever. But then the real culture possibly is what he calls are the underlying values and the hidden assumptions that you might have in an organization. And I think those come out when you know, in those kind of key moments, those key decision-making moments. I think those come out when companies are under stress. I think they've come up a lot during the pandemic in the last year or so, where people have gone back to their core purposes and played out their values. And those companies that have come through have probably had stronger and more aligned values with what they espouse and what they actually are. So I think when boards are able to have conversations where they're able to articulate what they stand for and what they don't stand for, and maybe if those are actually written down in statements, those are you know, really good practices that I think, you know, corporate governance professionals can support with that kind of a process. Yeah, so there would be some initial position statements on culture.
Fantastic, Jeremy. I know you could actually talk for the rest of the hour, and I wouldn't need to get a word in edgeways after that. The one thing I just wanted to note for those that are present who may well not need to know anything about King 4, which is South Africa's corporate governance code, our comparison to our UK corporate governance code. And they have a word in it that we've not yet addressed, and I see in a couple of other codes it's starting to filter in, is the word ethics. So not only do we have the word culture and the various terms of responsibility that we have, they've got the word ethics in theirs. It's one of the things we have covered when we've compared to the FRC's defined presence of good culture. You wanted to say something, Jeremy?
Well,
no, I can carry on.
No, keep going. Yeah, I mean, I think ethics is obviously a vital component Absolutely. Of this, a huge important competence of people. Yeah.
And in a lot of places, ours is in the guidance, and it's assumed, and it's there in the way that we talk about integrity. But the area I just wanted to cover with you now is boards. Sorry, let's put it this way: chairman, in terms of our code requirements, have got to create an environment that is conducive to quality conversation, alignment of culture to strategy, to have defined their purpose, their vision, their mission. They've got to create a fair airtime to all the directors that are in the room, giving everyone a chance to have a say, recognize their diversities, their differences, and having all those conversations. So these are all the things that a poor chairman's trying to do all at the same time, and summarily fail quite often at it. One of the things that comes out in that process of trying to get their ribs around all of that is they don't always create a safe environment for anyone to say anything that is necessary, either because they're a bully themselves, they have a personal agenda. There's that whole, I'm leading it, it's my way, and that's the way we're going to go. You know, typically CEO founders, I think I must actually leave my own business now because I've been there too long. So you know, that's the kind of thing that we see. And what are the characteristics we need in the company secretary that can support in the NED, SID, deputy, and all of them, to actually be able to find a way to ask those difficult questions so that you can unearth the elephants that are in the way of board effectiveness, board culture. So CEO role, NED role, chairman role in that space.
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack in there, which I'm happy to. So actually, I'm just thinking, I'm wondering whether this is a good time to put up the 11Cs model. Is that something you could
I can put, I've got close to hand the secondary version of it.
Yeah, perfect. Well, so
I'll do that. It's the second level rather than just the 11Cs themselves, but they're built inside here.
Perfect.
Yep, you go ahead in the meantime while I do this.
Yeah, so I'm just asking, I'm going to pull up as well. So I mean, something that may help orientate you all. So I think one of the things that we're talking about here is how do you assess whether a board is any good? And I've kind of been talking around this a little bit at the moment, and through the research that I did and through the thinking that I did and in creating the student textbook and then the good governance guide, professional handbook, was creating this model, and it's 11Cs, which I know Sharon feels slightly awkward about because it's not an even number, and you know we're looking for that 12th C. So if any of you guys have got any ideas, throw them in the chat. I have 3 Cs for each box and only 2 in the top right technical board one. It's somewhat slightly for on purpose because I'm kind of trying to de-emphasize that top right one. But yeah, I mean, just to kind of frame things, I'll just quickly talk through this, and then we can maybe have a context for. Therefore, then what can the company secretary do, and what should they be focusing on? So, I guess my argument is that I've said already about how can we make the shift from not just the necessary technical stuff on paper, but the shift down in that model to the behavioural things that, as a psychologist, is what I'm living and breathing as part of my professional background, and governance historically hasn't done. But more and more we're seeing that is something we need to do because that's where organizations generally trip up. And I'm saying, top right, there's a whole load of board structural stuff. So the 2 C's in there are about configuration and compliant. So, you absolutely need to tick the boxes as a company secretary on noticing and maybe advising on compliance with whatever codes you need to be following in whatever sector and country you're in, and configuration, you need to set yourself up right. So there's a whole list of things there, some bullet points in the top right about what a good configuration looks like and those decisions that you need to make. And obviously there's a whole lot of detail behind those, which is in the book if you wanted to buy it, which we might talk about later as a plug. So absolutely get that right, but then go top left where that's the board demographics, and that's usually, if you look at kind of end of year reports, what you might see in the pen portraits of board members, the kind of CV resume stuff, and the 3 C's in there about the capacity, capability, and how well connected board members are. They're often chosen for their network, maybe chosen because they've got a finance background. Often, it's a key skill. It may be for some other professional capital that they have from their experience. So absolutely you need that, and that's a key thing. But what I'm suggesting is you also need to drop down bottom left to what we talk about as board attributes, and the 3 C's in there are about competence, commitment, and character. And the character bit is very much about ethics, as Sharon just kind of picked up on. And there are ways of measuring that. There's a guy called Roger Steer who has a something called the moral compass, which you can buy as a psychometric to measure the ethical character, for example, of your board members. And there's a lot in there in that about, you know, what are the attributes that you're looking for. And I would say that the key attribute that is predictive of great board working is not an IQ thing, which would be more top left. It's more EQ, it's more emotional quotient, and it's more empathy. And what we know is, very surprisingly, actually, that you put a load of technical people together and they won't necessarily function well. It's been proved many times, or shown many times in experiments and looking at groups and teams that function well. You bring in someone with technical competence, you also need to have some ability to function as a team member, and empathy is key for that. And interestingly, women score higher on average at empathy on global measures of empathy. Doesn't necessarily mean you can't get women with low empathy or men with high empathy, but that's just an interesting take. And you know, we've seen some great examples on empathy recently. I'm going to, if I can find it, I'd love to share a quote from my favourite at the moment, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She said, "One of the criticisms I've faced over the years is that I'm not aggressive enough or assertive enough, or maybe somehow because I'm empathetic, it means I'm weak. I totally rebel against that. I refuse to believe that you cannot be both compassionate and strong." So I guess one thing I would really want to emphasize is, you know, if empathy is one of your key skills as a governance professional, that's superb, and I think that's modern leadership. So it's definitely something to aspire towards, and not to necessarily be aggressive. I think we've got too many egotistical, narcissistic leadership role models, and the more like Jacinda Ardern, the better. So yeah, so lots of attributes in there, and we can talk more about other IQs, and maybe as we go through around, you know, digital IQs, that kind of thing. But the real kicker is the bottom right, and I would say that, wouldn't I? But all the best practice and all the research basically says that if you don't get the board dynamics right, none of the rest of the stuff matters. So, for example, there was a study on this on 166 organizations all came together in this study, and they found that the boardroom dynamics aspect of those boards predicted the performance of governance and performance of the organizations by over 8 times the rest of what goes on the other parts of the model. So the 3 C's under dynamics are cohesion. So how can you build cohesion? Challenge, and those two are at a bit of a balance, a bit of a tension. How do you get both cohesion and challenge? Not too much cohesion, you get groupthink. Not too much challenge, or you create this kind of disastrous conflict. So that's a balance to enable an appropriate culture. So I guess, you know, that is the chair's job, supported by the Neds, the Eds, but also by those in and around the board, including you guys. Mm-hmm. So yeah, how do you do that? How do you do all that? Well, the first thing to do is probably to know where you stand. So board evaluation is a brilliant way of, you know, getting a baseline for all this stuff, and certainly making sure that some of those board dynamics aspects are part of that. And doing that quantitatively, I think, with interviews is a really good way, and observations of the board is a really good way. So board evaluation, what Sharon does is, you know, what I do as well, is a brilliant way of getting a baseline of where you're at, including dynamics. And then, yeah, cohesion. How do you build cohesion? It's difficult virtually, more difficult virtually, perhaps, but you've got to do things which enable people to build rapport, build relationships. And, you know, we can talk about how you do that in more detail, but you have to build that in. There's different ways to do that virtually as well. How do you build in challenge? Well, you create psychological safety. And I can talk more about that, but essentially I think it begins with cohesion, and then you build in the challenge. It's that way round. And then you're starting to build the culture you need. So, yeah, that's probably enough for now, but yeah, keep. We've
got some lovely questions and comments and statements coming, so please keep those rolling, because I will refer back to them very shortly. Question I want to cover now, and just going back to your point a moment ago though for a second, is how do you build the culture? And something we can talk about in a moment as well, maybe later, is the percentage of that comes from the leadership and the personality of the chairman and the different personalities around the board. But before we do that, I'd just like to talk about decision making in a boardroom environment. I mean, there's often this sort of tongue-in-cheek statement, if you want something to take forever, never make a decision, ask a committee to handle the project. So here we are with the board, which is a group of people. All these board committees are groups of people, the executive group, a group of people. And I know sometimes when I'm chairing a meeting, it becomes an environment of silence. Everyone's got a lot of teeth in their mouth, but not a lot of thoughts coming out easily, which requires a much stronger chairing competency to bring out that opinion, commentary. And when you ask, everyone's got plenty, but they don't come forward. They're too English, too British. English, I think. I think some of the British are not like that, but some of the English definitely are. And one of the key aspects of a board's responsibility, not the only one, but just a one, is to make decisions. And if we look at the things that impact decision making, we're looking at bias. You talked about the quotients, those of Kakabatsi, those of Genius's quotients. We talk about the different systems thinking, system one thinking, which guys are sort of very agile, make instant decisions, very emotive in their decision making, whereas others need to think, reflect. And it was interesting listening to you talk about how professionals come up with a different ability and of using their brains in certain environments, and as a coach how you've worked with them, because that's definitely been my finding in working with boards. So your different thinking styles, and then the other one is the competence someone has to speak up, to step up, to say something. So you've got all these different component factors. How does a board effectively make decisions?
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and there's a lot in there about decision making. And as you said, the board is there to make decisions. That's one of the kind of key characteristics of what boards should do. I quite like Peter Hawkins's model of the gears of a board. Yeah, so I just kind of, when I think of board meetings and a frame for what a good board meeting should be like, and he talks about these three gears. So scrutiny, and I would say scrutiny is maybe not always the right word. It could be more kind of support and challenge. I think scrutiny has a more of the challenge aspect to it. So it's more, cohesion and more the kind of mentoring as well as challenge. The second gear being more around creating good dialogue and debate, and to your point about developing strategic thinking, and then the third gear being making some decisions based on that. And so I think it's just being aware of, in a board meeting, what you're doing, which gear are you in, and hopefully a chair will be aware of that and will be explicit, saying, we're talking, this is for discussion, or this is, where we're in. I think sometimes agendas don't help that, because we have agenda points rather than those three gears, so that it's almost like you need to overlay those three gears onto each of the agenda points. Is there a decision here, or is it just information, or and do we need that, and could that be more efficiently done beforehand, or in another meeting? I think decisions aren't just one and done. It's about clarifying what is the question that the decision is trying to get to. So maybe you've heard this process where one meeting may be about just getting the information, being clear on what the decision is and whether it needs to be taken in the first place, or what is the question the decision is trying to ask, before another meeting being then the exploration of the options, and then another meeting being, well, which of those options? So splitting decisions out, I think, is important. And I think that does a lot to reduce bias. And when we think about bias, there's a whole raft of topics on bias. There's some great books out there on decision making. Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow would be one I would highly recommend to people. So Danny Kahneman Tversky, won the Nobel Prize for essentially bringing to economics the idea of behavioral economics. People don't behave rationally, and they have bias. So to recognise that we all have bias is really important. And then if we all have bias, how do you get against that? Well, you try and be more evidence based. So I would highly recommend that people think about where are you getting your information from? Is it just from people's opinions? Is there some Is there some best practice or good practice that you can relate to? Is there some research on something? Can you ask the people who the decision will impact what they think? So that, evidence-based decision making looks at all these aspects and shows that when you get more evidence on the table, you get better quality decisions. So I think that's one thing. Get all the evidence on the table, and then it comes into just the quality of the dialogue. So I've talked about psychological safety, which emerges from this balance of cohesion and challenge. I think when people feel comfortable, they are then able to voice their opinion. So so you may have all the data and the best evidence, and maybe nicely structured, but if people aren't then, as you say, speaking up or enabled to speak up and feel comfortable doing that, then you're not going to get anywhere. So I think one technique there is for the chair to go last. Don't express your opinion, and it's pretty simple, but it very rarely happens. And often there's a conversation about how tactically we're going to get this decision to go through, and let's position this in a certain way. So I think if you really want to get valid open opinion, where you get the wisdom of the crowd, then the chair probably has to go last.
Just linking straight to your point you've just made now, we talk about the modern company secretary. You talk about them being the corporate athlete. We talk about them being the silent witness. We talk them about being the power behind the throne. The people who actually have the highest empathy within the organization, the person who knows most about the organization within the room, because they've got their feels and touching from an executive point of view, but they've got all the empathy and they don't have the same kind of line responsibility that certain other executive directors might have. And how do you think their role plays today as the modern 21st century company secretary? Not the administrator part of it, but more the board company secretary. So it's a very specific part within the company secretarial space. What do you see as their role over the time ahead? What are they actually achieving today in the big corporates of the UK?
Well, I think the best people out there are recognizing that they are in a strategic leadership role. And I think just knowing that you're a strategic leader is really important. You may not be the person out front, you may not be the one that is on the stage, either within a boardroom or literally, but I think you have incredible opportunities to influence using kind of soft power, I suppose. And when I think about what does a good conversation in a board look like, I would say it has the hallmarks of good dialogue. And when I think of dialogue, it means that, so there's these different tensions of dialogue. You have, to have any conversation, there are 4 parts to it. You have a mover and you have an opposer. So often that is in a kind of advocacy dialogue, and people often kind of, banging heads, and there's concussion in the boardroom, people going backwards and forwards. That's not a good dialogue. That's just arguing. What you also need is this inquiry dynamic between the follower and the bystander. You might have heard some of those terms before. And what that takes is just brilliant listening. I think listening's popped up in the chat. Noticing what's going on, and I think, the antennae in the corporate memory and, all of that is definitely something that the governance professional can step into. And then the point is that you go from this kind of following, noticing, listening role, and you step into, and it's a bystander role actually, which sounds quite weak, but actually can be hugely impactful when you come in with an appropriate question or a notice. So I noticed that we're talking about this, and we were planning to talk about this. So where would you like to go? Or something like that. It just completely transforms a conversation. Usually with a notice and then a question, and you can do that in one-to-ones with board members. And I suppose essentially it's a great coaching and facilitation skill, which hopefully good chairs would have as well. But I think that's an absolutely core component of a great company secretary. It's this kind of application of open questions which you don't know the answer to. It's humble inquiry, which is another Edgar Schein term. Little thin book, Humble Inquiry. I'd highly recommend of his as well. So it's kind of the coaching skill set for the company secretary. And
the listening part of it, the EQ part of that is absolutely critical. You were talking about them having the pulse on, and I'm using different words to you, but on what is happening, whether it be regulatory, whether it be within the investor framework, what's going out there in the market, what are our customers expecting of us. And this whole ESG, climate change, green agenda, look after the planet, look after our community, look after our staff, all those things have finally sort of come home to roost a little bit more following the pandemic being forced upon us. That I think some boards that really had those kind of risks are not real. Now we've suddenly got things that we've been trying to ignore that we can't ignore anymore. Where are boards, where's company secretaries, where investors, where regulators on this new theme? Because it's not in most of our codes yet directly. Yeah. Indirectly it is, because we talk about community.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, I guess it's just because it's not in the code doesn't mean
exactly.
mean do something. Get ahead of the game. And I'm noticing, just flick the. Ted's asking a tricky question: how do you influence the board to be better? Never mind perfect. I mean, around these types of issues, I think is a good example. So, yeah, as you say, Sharon, how do you get things like environment, social, and governance topics into the board? I think you bring the stakeholders in somehow. So there are all kinds of ways of doing this. They're literally getting stakeholders to come and share what it's like for them in the board, or just having that lens when you're selecting and recruiting is obviously huge from a diversity point of view. Anyway, I think I've heard some techniques like using an empty seat. Or seats representing your stakeholders. So, what would this stakeholder be saying to us? What would they think about this topic? So kind of metaphorically bringing them into the room. Bringing experts in to educate around those kind of things to board members. I was listening to something today about digital transformation, and often boards aren't necessarily educated in everything to make decisions around that kind of stuff, because it's new, and ESG is similarly new. So I think there's an education piece in there. And I think broadly, one of the things that I write about around stakeholders is this concept of 6 lenses, and 6 lenses that you can view the board around. So one is you can view them as an individual lens. So look at individuals, and if something goes wrong, you can blame people individually. Well, maybe there's some incompetence, but often we commit in psychology what's called the fundamental attribution error, which is when somebody does something wrong, we blame them because it's their fault. If we were to do it wrong, it was a one-off. It was specific to that context. So it's just recognizing that an individual may be behaving in a certain way because of something else in the system. Mm-hmm. So second lens is the dynamic between pairs. Third lens is the board dynamic between the group. Fourth is the board purpose and task. Have you got that clear? The 5th is external stakeholders, and the 6th is, kind of global issues like the pandemic, like environmental issues. How much are they being brought in to the conversation? So just being aware that there are different lenses that you could have conversations around, I think, is one way of shifting people's perspective.
It's interesting that we are seeing that change into that ESG space occurring because of what has happened to the planet, and they can see the planet changing. So it's good, something. As I say, to every dark cloud, there's a silver lining. I'd like to pick up on some of the questions now that are in the chat that we've not already made reference to chatting now. But we talk about, you talk about the meeting room, and you talk about the space that's made friendly and conducive, but also the pre-preparation. You made early reference to it about the people, the persuasion, people talking about things, framing things, getting influence around what your outcome objective is, trying to get people to bring topics up in the right kind of order within a meeting. So the question is around pre-board meeting discussions and preparation. Do you want to just give us something around that space?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the term there, kind of persuasion, is an interesting one. So the history behind that, there's this guy called Robert Cialdini that some of you may have come across. He wrote a kind of seminal book on influence. I think his book is called Influence. And it's been used by marketeers for years, probably about 20 years old now, maybe a bit more. And some useful things about influence. And that was kind of in the moment, how do you influence someone? But his latest book, which came out about 2 or 3 years ago, was basically it was called Presuasion. And he basically said, well, yeah, those things I identified were really important, but you don't really have to do them if you set conditions up for success beforehand. And if you create the right environment, then good things will kind of naturally happen. So yeah, what does that look like? It looks like, setting up everything up to do with board meetings thoughtfully, and noticing, how that might set, not necessarily maliciously or malevolently, influence things, but just influence things so that the dialogue is better and people are more prepared. So yeah, I mean, I think because we have more virtual work now, I think it's absolutely imperative to have a conversation with everyone before you go into a meeting. I think that's hugely important. I know it takes longer, but just doing that and checking out with people, where are they at, what are their thoughts about things, what would they like space to talk about, what's important, all of that stuff. I think it's just, and it builds relationships as well, so that they feel more comfortable with them, you feel more comfortable with them, they're probably more likely to challenge later on.
There's a question that you did allude to a little moment ago of Ted's talking about the tricky question of how does company secretary influence the board to be better, never mind perfect. If I could take that question another step more specific, the role of company secretary in in the relationships within the organization, they have a line management responsibility, just somebody, hopefully the CEO, and they have this very dotted line that's almost a solid line to the chairman. And in some cases, actually, some have a full line to the chairman and a dotted line the other way around. So I've seen both, where the company secretary is sort of not in the executive team, but they are in the executive team. They're right-hand man to the chairman, and therefore seen to be a conduit of all information out of the company is just flowing into the chairman, which never is the case, but that's the perceived situation of an insecure executive director, for example, or CEO or finance director, doesn't matter. So where do you see that role of the company secretary really making that board effective, as Ed was referring to? Sorry, that it wasn't Ted, it was yes, it was Ted. But how can they actually get that chairman to be the best possible chairman possible? How can they make that difference? What can they do?
So
other than appointing you as the coach to fix them.
Well, I mean, getting external support, sounding board support is obviously something that can be really helpful, especially when people are in transition, I would say. So, trying to transition a culture under particular stress, maybe starting a new role. I think that's a particularly good time to trigger getting external support, either coaching, mentoring support. But yeah, more broadly, I think I always think there's two things that a company secretary will need to do, which hopefully will be replicated in a board meeting to help them. One is building relationships. And I think that's just, it can never be underestimated. I mean, it's true of life, but I think if you can build better relationships with your key stakeholders, of which obviously, chair, CEO would be, absolutely key. And sometimes, you need to do a mediating role for those two to help them build better relationships too. I think that's huge. And so how do you build better relationships? Well, you talk to someone more frequently. You are able to talk to them about things that are professional and personal, and probably you need to share things, and go first and share things that are personal as much as you're maybe comfortable. But that obviously builds relationships. And the second thing beyond building relationships is to be really clear in terms of your contracting. And I don't mean kind of big C contracts. I mean contracting on what is your role. So there may be dotted lines all over the place, or actual lines, but actually, what is your role? What is your responsibility? What is the chair's role? What is their responsibility? What is the CEO's responsibility? And have everybody, and Ned's, said all of that. Just all of you need to be very clear what your role is, and for it to be agreed, because where things trip up is when roles aren't clear, and when people assume that they're clear on one side and when they're not clear on the other side, or when they overlap and people tread on each other's toes. And I think in terms of board cultures, when I've seen a board culture, for example, go wrong, it's when the non-execs have maybe taken too much of an executive role with the executives, and and the line, but the role line as two groups in that board has been stepped over, and all it took was someone like me just allowing people to say, well, what is your role? What is your role? Here's some frameworks about what too much and too little looks like, giving some feedback about when people have done it, and then agreeing what it is. And it's like, oh, great, we can now crack on. So building relationships, really contracting clearly around roles and responsibility. Those two, I think, will always help.
And a question that's just popped up very directly related to this three-way relationship that the company secretary has got with the CEO and with the chairman is what happens if the chairman and the CEO are in conflict with each other on something? I'm not going to try and give an example, but you can maybe share some examples. I've got plenty. And how do they balance what is right? I can give you some opinions, but I'm not going to be the chair and lead the conversation. I'm going to let you come up with it.
Well, I'm sure everyone listening probably has some thoughts on that as well. I mean, I'll share mine just as a stimulus, but yeah, these are definitely just my opinions and my experience. I think, I mean, in the book, in the kind of the need for the company secretary to be agile, I talk about different roles. Talking about different roles you may take, and mediator is one of them. So there are skills, there are qualifications in mediation you can take, which may be useful. But again, I think it comes down to relationship building, doesn't it? And recognizing that somebody may be talking which in a way that creates conflict, which isn't about them. Again, it may link to that thing I talked about, lenses. They may be at loggerheads because they're representing something. So it may be kind of representational conflict. I mean, there's something in psychology called the parallel process, which means that in how I'm talking to you, it's not necessarily me talking, it's me representing some other stakeholder talking, and it's kind of coming through me. Sounds a bit woo-woo, doesn't it? But that happens. So I think it's just both sides managing themselves to recognize that the other person's hopefully doing the best job that they can do with the information that they have, and then to inquire into why they're behaving in the way that they are, and not again assume that it's because they're a terrible person, they hate you.
And just adding to that, taking it a step beyond behavior, the company secretary invariably has a very different egotistical relationship with the risk factors around them. They're not the chair, they're not the CEO. So their inherent position has got a very different risk profile, and therefore company secretaries are usually better at knowing what's right for the company and using that lens for them to help mediate between two different parties who've got invariably bias and ego and influence attached to them. Yes,
yeah, and I completely empathise with the company secretary role. It's kind of how I feel from the outside, but as an internal, you're kind of internal and external at the same time. As you say, you have some perspective. So you're probably right, but it's just how to influence people to see your opinion.
Get there.
Yeah.
One of the questions that's come up, I'm just going to précis it a little bit, is you can have a board evaluation that is taken from the perspective of the softer side, the behaviors, the dynamics, the things that we've been talking about now this evening and what you've written about, but also coming from your professional side of being technically trained. How often do people ask for psychometric tests or embed them into the evaluation process, or use some of those more technical known things, not a questionnaire built by the evaluator? I'm talking about the having something around psychometric testing or things like that evidence some of the issues. How often does that get requested?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the request of it in itself is a sign of a board that is somewhat evolved in their thinking. So that's a sign. To be honest, not often at the moment. I think what is more likely to be the case is a board evaluation may unearth some issues, and then you might get board development as a secondary part from that. So I think it's probably not in the evaluation itself, but I think the evaluation may raise the awareness that it might be useful. So I'd probably see it that way around. And I think, you know, it's interesting when you look at what should you evaluate when you evaluate in a board. You know, there's a lot of technical things that are useful to evaluate. You know, just, you know, how good is the board pack? How helpful are the board meetings? You know, and also, you know, the competencies. You know, you've got all those competencies.
And also what the company wants, because effectively the board evaluation is theirs. What are their cycle of board effectiveness, maturity and evolution, what are they ready to absorb, and what's their framework for us as a board evaluator will work to as well at that point.
Yeah, and in the book there's a chapter on board evaluation, and there are 7 questions that I think provide quite a useful framework for board, you know, what to cover. And the first question is, why are you having a board evaluation in the first place? And I think, you know,
other than you have to.
Yeah, other than you have to, you know, are you really doing this because you want to improve? And why now, other than because it's just, you know, the yearly mark or the 3-year mark or whatever. So I think helping have a conversation about why you're doing this in the first place is a good place to start.
In the textbook, you do cover a lot around team dynamics, and you spoke a moment ago in your 6 lenses about the fact that there is a group, it's more than 3 people, it's a team of people. How do you find the dynamics of the team, and you talk about systemic team coaching and things like that, how do you get the team to work together when we know that committees are not always very effective and they're made up as a team of people?
Oh, it's a big question, isn't it? So, I mean, all of you.
It is your last, because we've just hit the hour.
Well, so, yeah, all of you will have worked in, I mean, whether it's been at work in a board, you know, board and that, in teams that have been singing and, you know, have been floating along. And I guess that, you know, one of the things to do would be to reflect on why that was the case. Often it's because there's great leadership. And I would say that leadership is more of a coaching style of leadership than an autocratic leadership. So I think, you know, just broadly, that is a good thing to think about. And when you look at great teams, Google did a study of their great teams, and what they came out with wasn't technical leaders, it was leaders that were great at coaching. So I think it's, you know, if there's one thing, I'd say a coaching style of leadership within that culture of a team can take quite a long way. Yeah.
Because if you coach one person, the CEO, and it's their turn now to come back into the boardroom, magically shifted, and nobody knows they've been coached, or not going to recognize or give them the empathetic space. But that we can pick up in the conversation later. I just want to formally close the event. We are staying open and online, and you can unmute yourselves and ask questions of myself, Jeremy, or anybody else that's put questions into the chat if you'd like to. I know there's a couple of toing and froings that have occurred in the chat space. What we will probably do of this, because people have said how interesting this has been as a content, is we've got the ability to actually get a transcription of the content. So there'll not only be the visual. From my side, we will organize for you guys actually a transcript of it and put it into a bit of a paper. Jeremy will put it past you first, and that will be something that people can have a look at as well, in addition, as a takeaway from this. I hope the students are now all going to pass the exams. Absolutely no problem. The author's told you everything you need to know, including 1 or 2 others. And you know, talk about getting 90%. I think you've heard a couple of things that weren't in the book, and you have got it from the author. So thanks very much, everybody. We've had a wonderful interactive chat facility. People have definitely contributed. There are a lot of questions that we haven't got to all. We didn't get to because Jeremy had already addressed them in what he's been talking about. But if there's a burning one, you now have the opportunity. Thanks to Keith and to Karen, who without we could not achieve any of these things. Justina, thank you very much for leading on the event and the introduction and getting certain things to happen for us. And thank you to the rest of the team.